Good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about who to include in your family tree. So this is kind of picking up where we left off last week once you create your family tree. One of the most common questions once you start your family tree is, who do I include in my family tree and who do I leave out? Well, before you can answer this question, you need to ask a different question. So that question is, what is the purpose of your family tree? Is it simply to show biological links between generations, or is it to paint an accurate portrayal of your family? So typically when you're starting your family tree, it's going to be those biological links, parent to child, and showing who the biological parents are, or at least who the known parents are. And you're going to be doing that before you branch out more. Later, after your tree is more established, you may want to add more details and people to your tree to get more accurate representation of the family, which is perfectly fine, and that might take some time before you're able to do it. In today's world, nearly everyone is either a part of or knows someone who's a part of a non-traditional family. You might be surprised to learn that it is more rare to be part of a traditional family than a non-traditional family. So the definition of a traditional family is a married couple with their biological children. And again, this is quite rare today, surprisingly. In reality, most families consist of multiple marriages, children from more than one partner or spouse, and adoptions, whether they're formal or informal. And this actually goes back especially over the last 200-300 years and even further. Most people would think that families in older times were traditional families in the sense of you don't run across divorce often, but you have to think that mortality rates were much more common. So therefore they did have multiple marriages, children from other spouses, other partners, and adoptions, typically informal, because they would take in the children of perhaps their siblings who passed away, or even their younger siblings if their parents passed away. So non-traditional families are more common than traditional families. So when starting your tree, you always want to begin with yourself and work your way backwards. You're going to hear me repeat this often because it is, again, this is always how you start. And then you want to include the 3 most important pieces of information when you know them: name, date, and locations. So before you begin looking for records, you want to enter your known family in this order, and then after your own details are entered, you'll enter these. So your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, so in other words, those direct ancestors, for as far back as you know or would like to go. So essentially that's filling out that pedigree chart as I showed last week. So what I mean by that, before looking for records, that's something that you write down. You write down what you know, their names, their birth, death dates, marriage dates, and the locations for each of those events. And then when you do a family group sheet, you can add your siblings. So this includes half, step, adopted, and foster siblings. So there's a place on that family group sheet that you can record that. And then also you can have the spouse of your siblings and your aunts and uncles, because you can do a family group sheet with your parents and you and your siblings on it. And then for your grandparents, each set with your parent and their siblings, which are your aunts and uncles. And then if you were to go further with extra family group sheets, you can have the children of your siblings and of your aunts and uncles. So these will be your niece and nephews and your first cousins. So you can do the same the further you go back for each generation, for as far back as you would like to go. This is not a requirement. This is just if you would like to go back this far, this is the best way to go. Write down what you know to begin with so that you have it on paper, so you can see what you do have before you jump in a boat and start adding things that could be incorrect. Excuse me. Remember that family trees are rarely simple and straightforward. The more you work on your family tree, the more information you're going to find and learn. You might run into brick walls, everybody does, but typically the more information you put in, the more information you're going to get and be able to find even more. It is ultimately up to you as to what information you choose to include and exclude. But if you have the information, why not record it? Excuse me. You never know when you might need it again. This is something that working at the library has shown me over and over. I have seen people come here time and time again telling stories that they were here years ago. They found an article in a book, mentioned their ancestor. They maybe made a copy of the page, but they never made a copy of the cover of the book. They did not write down maybe the page number, and they would show me the single page copy and ask me what book it came from. We have over 8,000 books in our genealogy department. I'm sorry, a single page is not going to tell me what book it came from. So again, if you have that information, you need to record it, but you need to record it correctly. So if you come across a source that has individuals on it and it is an accurate source, it has the family members that you know, and say it has other children you didn't know, record that. Add those individuals to your tree with the individuals you already know, and it has a source, so it tells you where they came from and where that information is. I always say, you know, it's best to have it and not need it than need the information years later and not have it. Because there's nothing worse than finding a connection and then remembering you saw this record or you saw this 5 years ago, but you have no clue where it is today, or you don't recall how that was supposed to be connected. It can be very frustrating. So some things to keep in mind once you're doing this, and I'm going to show several examples in a few minutes. When building your tree, you want to record and denote relationships between individuals in your tree, especially non-biological relationships. This is one of the reasons I do like Ancestry over Family Search and some of the other websites to build trees. Ancestry has many options as to the types of relationships individuals can have between each other. So for example, different relationships can be adopted, step, foster, guardian, an unmarried partner, legal, friend, or even a donor. And some of these might seem slightly silly. I believe there's even unknown or other on there now. But you have to think, some of these relationships can all be accurate. And there are relationships that are biological, but the descriptive term might not be something, it's not a spouse or anything like that. So, and also, of course, just because you have a married couple, that does not mean that that couple are the parents to all of those children, as we very well know. So it's very important to try to label the relationship. So know that if it is, say, a stepmother or an adopted parent, a guardian, further you go back, you're going to have more of guardians of orphans or children that their father has passed away instead of adopted parents, because there were not formal adoptions. And then you can have partners, so unmarried individuals who were parents of children. In today's world, of course, you might have those that are donors or friend. So things like that. And then you can also have a fan group, which I believe I've mentioned this before. Your fan group is going to be family, associates, and neighbors. So associates are also going to be kind of like friends, but Those are people that you want to know in your tree, and you might find out later that they are in fact family. So an example of knowing who the fan group is, when you're looking at census records, say in the early 1850 and 60s, you want to look at who the neighbors are. Look at who is living 2 or 3 pages before and after the family you're looking at. Chances are later down the road, some of the children are probably going to have married someone within the families around them. It's very, very common that family lived close by. Children might have grown up and gotten married, but they lived close by. So that's your fan group, the neighbors, family associates. So even if you're looking at wills, different types of documents, you might notice those names reappear because they lived close by, they signed documents, they were witnesses, and things like that. And later down the road, you might realize where they fit into the tree. So you want to make a note of who they are. If your ancestor was married more than once, include the marriage and the children. This also applies for a partner and children, even if they were not married. And there are benefits to this. You can often find more information on parents by looking at all of their children instead of only your direct ancestor. So, for example, one of the ancestors I'm going to focus on today is my 7th great-grandfather, Joseph Anderson. I descend from his oldest child and daughter, Mary Anderson. Because she was a female, she was born in 1792, other than the marriage record with her name on it, that is the only tangible record with her name on it. We do have her husband's name on many things, and we have her husband's name on records with her brother and her husband and things where we know that they traveled together, they signed documents together. But if it were not for tracing her siblings and her husband, we would have hardly anything else on the parents or connecting her to them. So sometimes you have to trace those siblings to get more information on the parents. So that's why it is often good to branch out. You can't get everything you need from just a single person sometimes, especially depending on the time period and if it is a female ancestor. And there's been many times that one of my ancestors might have been the oldest one, and so they died before there were death certificates. But if I followed one of their younger siblings who had a death certificate, it gave me the mother's maiden name. And I had proof that they were siblings on the same census record and such. So I was able to get information like that. So branching out is not always bad. I prefer to follow up on my collateral lines. I don't do just the lineal tree. Some people do just their direct ancestors, which again, that is how you start your tree. That's how you begin, and that's perfectly fine. I'm one of those that I've learned that the world is a lot smaller than we think it is. I have found connections to people that I met rather randomly, and then turns out we do have connections. Either we can find the paper trail or we have matched on DNA and we're still searching the paper trail. So I typically build one big tree. So I have my husband in my tree. So instead of creating a completely separate tree for him, I just added him as my spouse and started working on his tree, which brought quite a few surprises. So I'm going to go over a few things real quick to begin with. So this is one thing to keep in mind. What's your number? If you'll remember, every generation doubles. So in other words, you're one person. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 grandparents, and so forth. So you go down to 10 to your 7th great grandparents, 10 generations down. you have 512 seventh great-grandparents. So altogether, that's 1,023 individuals, or could be that many, just for that. So for one generation right here, 512 people. That does not mean that those are all individuals, however, because you can have the same set of seventh great-grandparents more than once. That actually is quite common also. So, and another example, again, these are those numbers, but this one just kind of goes back and forth. This shows many more generations back. So if you go back to an 18th great-grandparent, look at that, you have over 1 million. So this is just kind of an example of how small I say things are. So you think over 1 million people together and you go down to one person. So the likelihood, and you think of how many descendants they have. So if so many people in this world can trace back to a single couple in this group, which obviously not everyone can trace back that far, but even if you can trace back up in here to 10th great-grandparents, that is still quite a large number. So you could be related to someone, but it is several generations. It could be 8 to 10 generations back. It does not necessarily mean that you share any DNA whatsoever. So in other words, you are not blood related. You are related through a common ancestor 200 to 400 years ago. But almost everyone is able to do that. Trace back to somebody, but it is so far back, it is not quite relative DNA speaking. So I do want to point that out quite quickly. So I'm going, like I said, I put my husband's tree into mine. I started his. And a quick story, real quick, my husband was born in Hawaii and had moved here, and I moved here for college. Did not think any chance of relation. We have both done 3 different DNA kits. We are not related. But guess what? Both of our 7th great-grandfathers lived in Bulloch County at the same time. But if you remember, that is 10 generations back for both of us. So just because they lived here does not make either of us related. But because they each had several children, we do have common cousins, which means they share each of those ancestors. So I'm going to show that at the moment. So this is an example of my tree, which I'm sure everyone has seen. And you'll probably know my tree up and down. And you'll notice my tree is called the Not Really Wingate family tree, which I'll get to that in a little bit. So my tree going back, we're going to go right back here. And then you see I have to keep going back. So this is my Joseph Anderson, who's my Revolutionary soldier from Bulloch County. And you see how far I have to go back. And a lot of these I don't have filled in because I don't know who their parents are. So right in here, this is my Revolutionary ancestor, but I have traced all of his children. Like I said, his daughter, we have her story based on her marriage, her parents, and her children, but also through her siblings. And all of her siblings, except for, I believe, 2, traveled down to Thomas County. She had one brother who stayed in Bulloch County. So almost all of the Anderson family who remained in Bulloch County descend from that one brother. So this is the side that I am coming from, that I'm showing for this purpose. And you see how far that goes back. And then this is my husband's tree. And we are going, you see, I don't have everything filled out, but we're going through his great-grandfather's side. And then we're going all the way back here to this Bruton line. to Nathan Bruton right here and Nancy Fontaine. And so they lived at roughly the same time. They both lived in Bulloch County at the same time. Nathan Bruton stayed up here, but what's interesting is several of his descendants did travel down to Decatur County, whereas my ancestors went down to Thomas County, which they were actually very close together. So the families went down. So, but these were mostly in Tattnall County, Georgia, where the others were there. And so the purpose of this, these are both our lineal lines, direct ancestors going backwards. So you see I have headstone pictures, photographs, and things. This is only going backwards. I'm going to open up Nathan Bruton real quick. Now Nathan had several children, so you see right here, and I've researched several of them. And you'll notice right here, Elvira Jemima Bruton. Got Benjamin, Samuel, Clarissa, Simon. These are some of the, and Martha, the ones that I've researched more thoroughly. So Jemima is one that has been also very well researched, and she married John, who's known as Jack Hendricks, and he died very curiously. It's believed that, well, we know that him and his father-in-law did not get along very well, and that he might have been killed by his father-in-law, Nathan Bruton. But when Nathan wrote his will, he explicitly made sure that he left things to his daughter and grandchildren, but nothing to his son-in-law. But he didn't die for 20 years later, so his son-in-law was already deceased at that time. But a couple of days after Nathan died, his sons went to court and declared their sister insane, idiotic, so that she could not get any of the money left to her in her father's will, which was sad. She had several children by that point as well. So, but she's one who I've also traced down through all of her children. And so there are many connections going down through her. And that might sound confusing, but I'm going to kind of get to how that reconnects in a minute. So now I'm going to show, this is a cousin of mine. This is Bill Scott, and he lives up in Atlanta. He's a history student and fellow genealogist as well. And he is my 7th cousin once removed. He is also my husband's 7th cousin once removed, which I know sounds kind of odd, but and you see that I've put him in my tree, and I've not done all of his lines. I've not really worked on his mother. So going through his paternal grandmother, we're going right through here, and I'm just going to show a few different interesting things on his line. So this, I believe, is his 5th great grandfather, Hampton Sykes. And if you notice, his father is Jesse Asbury Durrance, but his mother is Charlotte Sykes. And as you know, typically you get the last name of your father, not your mother. This is one of those interesting cases where Jesse Durrance was having an affair with Charlotte Sykes. She was his mistress, not his wife. He was married to Elizabeth Sands at the time. There's actually an article in the Tattnall court where he was tried for adultery for these children. They had at least 4 sons out of wedlock, basically. So Hampton Sykes, he has the surname of his mother's maiden name. So that's one of those things that you would want to denote in your tree, that it is her maiden name and that they were never married. They were not a married couple, they were partners. And again, that's something very important to note, because otherwise you would be looking for a marriage record that you are not going to find. And also you would be wondering why these children were born at the same time his other children were being born with his wife that was still living and having children. So that's one of those things that is very important to do, and you want to look and you want to record if there was a second marriage, if there was an outside partner affair, so to speak. You see that he was born in 1784 and Hampton was born in 1834. This was quite a long time ago. These types of things happened even back then. They were not all saints, contrary to what some would believe. And so anyway, Hampton's wife was Mary Lewis, whose father was Wiley Lewis Jr. and mother was Rhoda Cannon. And I'll come back to why that part is important in just a minute. And their son, Daniel Sykes, married Maggie Hendricks. So you'll remember the Hendricks that I mentioned a minute ago. So we're going to go back about 3 generations. And here we have the Elvira Jemima Bruton, which I had just shown you a few minutes ago. And here's Nathan Bruton. So this is the common ancestor between my husband and our cousin, Bill. So Nathan Bruton is not related to me whatsoever, but he is related to my husband. So this is my husband's 7th great-grandfather, and it is Bill's 6th great-grandfather because he's 1 generation ahead of us. So that's what makes him a 7th cousin once removed. And then he comes through these lines right here. And it was interesting putting him in the tree because when I found the Rebecca Bennett, I realized that I already had her parents, Barnabas Bennett and Hannah Cannon, in my tree because of her sister, Mary Ann Bennett, who she is someone connected to another person in my tree, is Stephen Akins. So this is why I add all of these collateral lines, is to make all of these mini connections. And now I'm going to go to Leroy Lewis. And if you notice, his father is Wiley Lewis, and who are his parents? Wiley Lewis Jr. and Rhoda Cannon. So if you recognize those are the same parents that were right up here. So that means Mary Lewis and Wiley Lewis are brother and sister. Now that's not saying anything with them, but that means that Bill has Wiley Jr. and Rhoda Cannon as his 6th great-grandparents twice. So instead of having, you know, what would that be, 200 and something individuals as 6 great-grandparents, that would at least cut it down by 2. And then right here, he has Ellen Anderson, whose father is Joseph Fitzgerald Anderson Jr., and you see it goes right back to Joseph Anderson. So this is my 7th great-grandfather, and it's Bill's 6th great-grandfather. So again, that's how me and Bill are 7th cousins once removed. And then another part that is interesting, this is Sally Anderson, who her father is William F. Anderson. So his father is John F. Anderson Jr. and Elizabeth Burnside. You might recognize those names once again, right here. So that actually means that Leroy Lewis and Sally Anderson are first cousins. Their grandparents are the same individuals right here. So this means that here is another couple that are the same grandparents twice, or 6 great-grandparents twice. So, and this was very common in the South where they had multiple children. So at different generations, different marriages, the children would marry for a couple here and here, so to speak, which I know I was just moving my hands and you can't see me. But it was very common at that time. They could not travel far, and when you have so many first cousins with different names, you honestly don't always know who your first cousin is. If you had 80 first cousins and even 40 of those have a different last name, would you be able to recall who each one of those were? And so typically that was the case for most of these. And I mean, this was they were born still in the 1800s. So, but that is some of the connections that have been able to be made between us going back, which I think are very interesting. This is Bill's tree that he has done himself, which is, he's been working on this longer than me. So you see he has his mother's line filled out as well. And he's gone back much further on his Durance line and everything. So you see here he's got pictures, and he has some of these lines that go back to North Carolina and are much, very well documented. I admit I've only worked on adding him to my tree for about 3 days. So it's wonderful when you can add these connections and figure out how you're related to everyone. But even if you're going to add those biological links, sometimes you have to add outside sources. So the big example, the reason why my tree is called this is Rozier Shirley Wingate. This is the reason my tree is called the Not Really Wingate tree. If you notice right here, one of the tags that I have is illegitimate. So he is technically Rozier Shirley. His surname, his father was a Shirley. But, and the story was that his mother, Temperance Hudson, who was married to a Wingate, her husband had deserted or died. We're not 100% sure. She moved into the household of James Shirley and his wife, Prudence, but his wife was going to visit her parents, and she was actually pregnant at the time and had the child at her parents' house. So Temperance was taking care of the household. She was cooking, taking care of his other children, and doing things like that. And while his wife was gone, lo and behold, she became pregnant and had a child. So in other words, his wife was gone for a long time. Back in that time when you visited, you did not go for a week. You went for months to a year or more. So when his wife came back, Temperance was very quickly sent a packing, so to speak. But James made sure that Rozier stayed, and he raised him. So Rozier stayed with his father and living in Alabama, actually, until he was about 18. And then he moved to Georgia, where his mother was, and his brothers, who his brothers were Wingates. But he didn't want to cause shame to his mother, so he took her married name, Wingate. And it was fairly commonly known that he was not a Wingate because the story has been passed down over and over. If you look at his siblings, he has many half-siblings. Well, pretty much all of his siblings are half-siblings. They're either a Wingate or a Shirley, because he's the only one who was born between Temperance and James. So he has Shirley siblings and he has Wingate siblings. And so he took the name Wingate even though he is a Shirley. So that means that my entire family that descend from Rozier, we have absolutely no Wingate DNA in us at all. We only have the Shirley DNA, which is interesting. Of course, I would have none of the Y DNA to begin with. But I have to include those collateral lines because he married Martha Ann Shiver, but his brother, or his half-brother, John Wesley Wingate, married Martha's sister, And so there again, you have two brothers who married two sisters. And then also his half-sister, Melissa Pearl Shirley, she married, I believe it was Key, and their daughter married his youngest son, Lewis Garner Wingate. So again, if you don't include the family members of siblings and so forth, as you're going down your own tree, you're not going to have all of those connections. So in other words, if I didn't include all of his siblings and all I did was say his children, when I would add his wife, there would be no way to add that, oh, that was actually his half first cousin. So you need to be consistent. And again, if you have the information, enter it. And that's what I say. If you're doing this, you don't always have to pursue it. But see, I have letters from them. I have Bible records, several photographs, but I have handwritten letters from some of the descendants describing his appearance, growing up, who his parents and grandparents were, and things like that. So you always want to try to branch out whenever you can. Again, if you have that information, you can include it, and it is your tree. So if you do not want to include this information, you do not have to. And just for laughs, for anyone who knows me, you'll already know this and you can get a good laugh. So yes, I was married recently. And so here you go. Here is my little family, and who are my children? My 3 little dogs. So see, you can add to your tree who you want to add. It is all up to you. So when people ask who do you include in your tree, you include your biological family, you include your lateral family if you wish, and it's up to you. They're the only true exceptions. You cannot just add people randomly, if that makes sense. If you want to include, say, cousins or grandchildren, you do have to put somebody in there where they came from. So even if, say, you and a daughter-in-law had a falling out, but you love your grandchildren to death and you want to have your grandchildren in your family tree, and they're not going to have sources, of course, you still want to put the name of your daughter-in-law in your tree so you know that for the grandchildren. You don't have to follow up on her side of the family. You don't have to do anything like that. But you want to know who that person is. So there are some things that you do need to do in that regard. The same going backwards in your family tree. If you have a couple that had, you know of 10 children, you know the father's name, but you don't know the wife's name, or you only know of a first name, that is perfectly fine. That's very common. You can put just the first name. The Joseph Anderson that I showed, we only know his wife's name to be Sarah. We do not know her maiden name. There are other cases where sometimes we do not even know the wife's name. We know there had to have been a mother, but we don't know her name. And so you can put something as an unknown, first name unknown, or last name unknown. There's things you can do as placeholders. For dates, even negative information is information. So you could know absolutely nothing about her. And I'm just using an example as her because men are typically easier to trace further back. But if you know that this set of children most likely came from her, if you know the earliest child born, then you know that she had to have been within childbearing years when that child was born. So that can help you guess an age that she might have been, or a year that she was born. The last child born, she was at least alive when that last child was born. So that'll give you a date for that. So you can at least try those age ranges to give you more information. And that'll help you build your tree. That'll help you give more information. And later you can add more, you can take more away. And just putting those names in as placeholders, that'll help you with that. You don't have to follow up to it, but years later you might want to. So I hope that helps with building your tree. And if you have any questions, remember you can post them in the comments. We'll be doing the Q&A on Monday. You can email them to me or, of course, post them on Facebook. Thank you.